The courtroom was dead silent when David Walker crouched down to eye level with the small boy and said those words. "Your mama is the bravest person in this whole county, son." 8-year-old Thomas Callahan stared up at the sheriff with wide, brown eyes that held a year's worth of grief and confusion, and something that looked dangerously close to hope. His lower lip trembled. His small fists were balled at his sides. Behind him, through the frosted glass window of the Redemption Creek jailhouse, a crowd had gathered: merchants, ranchers, women clutching their shawls, all of them waiting to hear the verdict that would determine whether Caroline Callahan would walk out of that building a free woman or ride out of town in shackles bound for the territorial prison in Santa Fe. Thomas had not spoken in 3 days. Not since they had dragged his mother through the center of town in the early morning dark, her wrists bound with rope, mud on her dress, her dark hair loose and wild around her shoulders. He had seen it from the upstairs window of the Miller boarding house where they had been staying since they lost the farm. He had pressed his small palm flat against the cold glass and watched, and something inside him had gone quiet in a way that frightened even the women who tried to comfort him. David Walker had not slept in those same 3 days. He had spent them tearing apart every piece of evidence that Judge Harlan Pruitt and the Becker brothers had constructed against Caroline, working by lamplight until his eyes burned, riding out to the Callahan land in the pre-dawn hours to examine the scorched timbers and overturned soil, talking to witnesses who were afraid to talk, pressing his badge against his chest at night as if the metal could remind him why he had taken this job in the first place. Because the truth was, David Walker had been slowly falling in love with Caroline Callahan for the better part of 6 months before any of this started. And now the woman he loved stood accused of arson and theft, and the man who had accused her, Silas Becker, cattle baron, richest man in the county, a man who smiled like a preacher and operated like a cutthroat, sat in the front row of that makeshift courtroom with his hat in his hands and murder in his eyes. And Thomas was looking up at David like he was the only solid thing left in the world. "You really think so?" the boy whispered. It was the first thing he had said in 3 days. His voice was rough and small. David put a steady hand on the boy's shoulder. "I don't just think it," he said quietly. "I know it, and today everybody in this county is going to know it too." He stood up, straightened his hat, and pushed open the door to the courtroom. The story of how Caroline Callahan came to be standing trial in the town of Redemption Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the autumn of 1884, began 14 months earlier on a Tuesday in late August when a woman stepped off the southbound stage from Albuquerque with a carpetbag in one hand, a boy on her hip, and a deed to 320 acres of land in the other. She was 26 years old that August, and she had the kind of face that people looked at twice, not because it was pretty in the conventional way, though it was, but because it had something in it that most faces you saw in frontier towns lacked entirely: steadiness, a quiet, iron-centered calm that lived behind her dark eyes even when the rest of her was clearly exhausted and uncertain. Thomas was 5 years old and had his father's coloring light hair, freckles, and his mother's eyes. He clung to Caroline with the comfortable ease of a child who had never been made to feel like a burden, which was notable given what they had been through. Martin Callahan had died 2 years prior. Fever, quick and unreasonable the way fever was in those years. He had left Caroline a small inheritance, a deed to land his uncle had bequeathed him in New Mexico Territory, and a son who was going to grow up to be exactly like him, stubborn and kind, and unable to leave a wrong unpunished. Caroline had spent 2 years in St. Louis trying to make it work without the land. She had taken in sewing. She had taught piano lessons. She had maintained a boarding room with the dignity of a woman who refused to be pitied even when pity would have been easier to accept than pride. But St. Louis was expensive and unforgiving, and eventually the only rational choice was the one that frightened her most: go west, work the land, build something. She had written 3 letters to the county seat of Redemption Creek before she arrived, making inquiries about the property, about water rights, about the nearest school for Thomas. The third letter had been answered by the county sheriff, who wrote back in a careful, plain hand that the land was sound, the school was decent, and that any widow woman planning to homestead alone ought to know that the Becker operation ran cattle on the northern side of the creek and had a habit of encroaching on neighboring claims. She had appreciated the honesty. She had not expected the sheriff to be waiting at the stage depot when she arrived. David Walker was 31 years old and had been the sheriff of Redemption Creek for 2 years. He was not what most people imagine when they pictured a frontier lawman. He was not loud. He did not swagger. He wore his badge with a kind of matter-of-fact restraint, as if it were simply the clearest expression of something he would have been doing anyway. He was lean and dark-haired, with a jaw that had been broken once in a bar fight in Tucson 5 years before, and had healed slightly crooked, which gave his otherwise even-featured face a quality that women in Redemption Creek spent a fair amount of time discussing. He did not carry his gun on his hip in the theatrical fashion of men who wanted people to know they were carrying. He carried it practically, and he used it rarely, and when he did use it, he hit what he aimed at. He had met the stage because he had a town full of people who needed looking after, and because any newcomer, especially one who was about to stake a claim adjacent to the Becker land, was his business. He had not expected to see Caroline Callahan step off that stage and have the immediate, irrational sensation that the whole landscape had shifted slightly to accommodate her. She had looked at him with those steady dark eyes, the boy balanced on her hip, the carpetbag cutting into her palm, and said, "You must be the sheriff who wrote to me." "David Walker," he said, and took the carpetbag from her hand before she could object. "Ma'am, I don't need carrying," she said, but she let him take the bag. "No, ma'am," he agreed. "I can see that, but I've got 2 hands and one of them is idle." Thomas had looked up at him and said, with the directness of a 5-year-old who had decided something, "Are you the law?" "I am," David said. Thomas nodded seriously. "Good." That had been the beginning, though neither David nor Caroline would have called it that for a long time afterward. What they would have called it in those first weeks and months was a professional relationship, neighborly, civic. He helped her understand the water rights dispute that was already simmering along the creek line. She brought bread to the jailhouse when she baked, because she always made too much and waste was sinful. He stopped by the Callahan claim every other week, ostensibly to check on the boundary markers. She started leaving coffee on when she saw his horse on the road. The trouble with Silas Becker started in October, 6 weeks after Caroline arrived. Silas Becker was 52 years old and had built his cattle empire in New Mexico territory through a combination of genuine business acumen and ruthless opportunism. He was not entirely without charm. He dressed well, spoke carefully, and donated to the church roof fund. He was also the kind of man who had decided, very early in life, that the law was a convenience for people who lacked the resources to operate above it. He came to Caroline's claim on an October afternoon with 2 of his ranch hands and a smile that did not reach his eyes, and he told her, with great courtesy, that the land she was farming had traditionally been considered part of the Becker grazing range, and that he would be pleased to purchase her deed for a fair price before she wasted another season trying to work soil that would not support a proper crop. Caroline had listened to every word he said. Then she had told him that her deed was registered at the county seat, that her water rights were legally established, and that she intended to plant winter wheat in the lower field and would appreciate it if his cattle were kept on his own side of the property line. Silas had stopped smiling. "You do well," he said quietly, "to think carefully about your situation here, Mrs. Callahan. A woman alone, a child, this is hard country." "I've noticed," Caroline said. She did not look away from him. "Good afternoon, Mr. Becker." He left, but he did not forget. David heard about the visit from Bill Hannigan, who ran the feed store and heard everything that happened in a 10-mile radius. He rode out to the Callahan claim the next morning and found Caroline mending a fence post on the eastern boundary with Thomas handing her nails from a tin can. He had stood beside her for a moment, watching her work with a quiet competence that made the fence post seem like a worthy opponent she was simply going to outlast. "Becker came to see you," he said. "He did." She drove another nail. "You want to tell me what he said?" she told him. David listened without interrupting, which she had already noticed was a thing he did, and which she had already decided she liked. "He's been trying to run off the Hendersons for 2 years," David said when she finished. "They've got the claim on the south side. He wants this whole creek valley." "I know," Caroline said. She had done her research. "He won't get my land, Sheriff." "No," David said. He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly professional. "I don't imagine he will." It was Thomas who first noticed that something particular was happening between his mother and the sheriff, because children notice everything that adults tell themselves they are carefully concealing. By December, when the first cold came in and David Walker had helped Caroline winterize the stock shelter and stayed for supper twice in 1 week, Thomas had begun casually referring to him as Sheriff David in the easy, proprietary way of a child who has decided to claim someone. Caroline told herself the friendship was practical. David Walker was the law in this county. He understood the terrain and the politics. He was useful. She told herself this firmly on the night in early January when he stayed late helping her with the accounts, and she looked over at him bent over the ledger by lamplight, and her heart did something that had nothing whatsoever to do with practicality. She had loved Martin Callahan. She wanted to be honest about that, inside her own mind, because honesty was the thing she prized most in herself. Martin had been good and kind, and she had grieved him truly. But she was 26 years old and Martin had been gone for 2 years, and the feeling that rose in her chest when David Walker looked at her with that quiet, attentive gaze was something she was going to have to reckon with eventually. She just was not ready to reckon with it yet. David Walker had his own reasons for caution, and they lived in his past the way dark things tend to live, not loudly, but persistently. He had been engaged once, 5 years ago in Tucson, to a woman named Rachel who had decided, with 3 weeks to the wedding, that she could not marry a lawman. Not because she did not love him, she said, but because she could not live in the permanent state of waiting to be told he was dead. She had married a banker in Phoenix, and David had come to Redemption Creek and buried the whole business under enough work that he rarely had to feel it anymore. But Caroline Callahan had a way of making him feel things he had successfully avoided feeling for 5 years. And this frightened him in a way that no physical danger he had ever encountered had managed to frighten him, which was saying something, because he had been in 2 gunfights and a fire, and 1 genuinely concerning encounter with a rattlesnake in a bedroll. February brought the next escalation from Becker. 3 of Caroline's cattle turned up dead on the south pasture. No visible cause. The county veterinarian, Doc Greer, came out and examined them and said, carefully, that it looked like poisoned water, though he could not be certain. The water in the south pasture drew from a different source than the main creek, a small secondary channel that ran along the border of the Becker land. Caroline did not cry when she found the cattle. She stood in the frozen pasture with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and she was so still that David, standing beside her, could see exactly how much effort that stillness was costing her. 3 cattle were a third of her herd. They were money she could not replace without selling the winter wheat before it was ready. "He's trying to break you down slowly," David said. "I know. I can't prove it was him, not without more evidence. I know that too." She turned to look at him. "I'm not going to leave, David." It was the first time she had used his given name without the title. Neither of them mentioned it. "I didn't think you were," he said. He spent the next 2 weeks building a case against Silas Becker. He collected water samples from the secondary channel, which Doc Greer confirmed showed traces of arsenic. He tracked the source of the contamination to a point clearly on the Becker side of the property line. He filed a formal complaint at the county seat and sent a report to the territorial marshal's office in Santa Fe. And then Judge Harlan Pruitt, who had been appointed to the bench in this district 3 years ago, and who had, in David's private assessment, never made a decision that worked against Silas Becker's interests, dismissed the complaint on a procedural technicality. This was the moment David Walker fully understood the depth of what he was dealing with. The Becker operation was not just a land dispute. It was a captured system. Becker had the judge. David strongly suspected he had at least 2 members of the county board. The law in this corner of New Mexico territory was a shell that Silas Becker had hollowed out and was wearing like a costume. He told Caroline this on a cold February evening sitting at her kitchen table, and he told her all of it, not softening any of the details, because she deserved the full truth and he knew she could handle it. She listened. She was quiet for a long moment after he finished. "What do we do?" she asked. "We build something he can't dismiss," David said. "A case so clean and so documented that it goes over Pruitt's head to Santa Fe, to the territorial level, where Becker doesn't have his people. How long will that take?" "Months, maybe longer." She looked at him. The lamp on the table cast warm light across her face, and he could see the exhaustion under the composure, the weight of the constant vigilance she maintained, and something else, something quieter and more personal, in the way she was looking at him. "Then we'd better get started," she said. Spring came, and with it a shift between them that neither one of them was pretending wasn't happening anymore. David was at the Callahan claim 3 or 4 times a week now, and the reasons had long since stopped being purely official. He and Thomas had a running competition involving a set of carved wooden horses that Thomas kept on the windowsill, the rules of which changed each visit according to Thomas's preferred odds. Caroline had started saving the second cup of coffee every morning, and only stopping herself once before she admitted, quietly to herself, that she was saving it for him. He kissed her for the first time in April, standing in the kitchen doorway after an evening of reviewing the evidence files, and it happened the way real things happen, not dramatically, not with a grand declaration, but simply and inevitably, the way water finds its level. She had said something that made him laugh, and then she had been looking at him while he was looking at her, and then there was no longer any reason not to. She pulled back after a moment and looked at him with those steady eyes and said, "I need you to know something." "Tell me," he said. "I am not a woman who will be made uncertain on purpose. If this is something real, I need it to be honest. I can't afford pretty lies." "I know you can't," he said. "I'm not a man who deals in pretty lies." "I know," she said. She reached up and touched the crooked line of his jaw with 2 fingers, the most deliberately tender gesture she had made since he met her. "I know you're not." Thomas, who was supposedly asleep and was definitely not asleep, made a strategic amount of noise coming down the stairs precisely 10 seconds later, and David and Caroline both stepped apart with the guilty speed of people who had not, in fact, been doing anything wrong. Thomas appeared at the bottom of the stairs, looked at both of them with a solemn 5-year-old's assessment, and announced that he was thirsty. Caroline got him water. David hid his smile behind his hat. The crisis point that would eventually land Caroline in a jailhouse and David Walker in the worst 3 days of his life arrived in September, 14 months after Caroline first stepped off the stage from Albuquerque. Silas Becker had grown impatient. His attempts to pressure Caroline had failed. His attempted legal maneuvers had been frustrated by David's meticulous documentation, which was now the subject of an ongoing inquiry from the territorial marshal's office, something Becker had not anticipated, and which had made him furious in the contained, cold way of men who are used to winning. He had lost 2 hands to the inquiry, men who had quietly refused to be named in depositions, and so he had moved to a different kind of plan. He had found a man named Roy Cates, a drifter with a record of petty theft and small crimes across 3 territories, and he had paid him in cash and land promises to do 3 specific things. First, to start a fire on the eastern quarter of Caroline's claim, the section nearest the road. Second, to leave evidence at the scene that pointed to Caroline herself as the arsonist, a scarf she had lost 3 weeks earlier, and which Becker's man had retrieved from the dust near the well. Third, to steal the deed to the Callahan claim from the county records office, which Becker had a key to through his arrangement with the county clerk. Without the deed in the records, Caroline's claim to the land was legally complicated, at best. With a fire that she was accused of setting, insurance fraud being the alleged motive, a claim being made that she had taken out a small policy on the farm building 6 months prior, and with Judge Pruitt willing to convene a rapid hearing, Becker calculated that the woman would be broken, discredited, and gone within a month. He had not counted on David Walker. The night of the fire, David was not in Redemption Creek. He had ridden to the Henderson farm on the south side, following up on a complaint that Becker's men had been cutting Henderson's fence line. He saw the smoke from 3 miles away, and the horse he was riding was a fast one. He arrived at the Callahan claim to find the eastern barn burning cleanly, the way a fire burns when it has been set with intention and accelerant, not the way it burns when it starts from accident. Caroline was outside with Thomas, both of them safe. She had woken at the smell of smoke and had gotten Thomas out of the house first, before anything else, before grabbing the locked box of documents she kept under the floorboard, before doing anything for herself. She was standing in the yard watching her barn burn. Thomas was pressed against her side. She had a bruise on her arm from where she had hit the door frame coming out fast in the dark. David jumped off his horse before it had fully stopped and crossed the yard to her, and she turned to look at him, and for just a moment, a single unguarded second, the composure broke and he could see everything underneath it. The fear, the grief, the bone-deep exhaustion of a year of fighting. He put his arms around her and she let him, her forehead against his shoulder. Thomas pressed against both of them in the dark while the barn burned orange against the black sky. She did not cry, but she shook just slightly, just for that one moment, and then she was steady again. "I woke up and smelled it," she said. "I got Thomas out first." "Of course you did," he said. He examined the fire scene by lantern light when the flames had died down enough to approach. He found the scarf. He noted immediately that it had been placed, not dropped. It was sitting too neatly on the edge of a burned timber, at exactly the point where someone wanted it found. He also noted the smell of lamp oil on the eastern wall in a pattern that started from the outside, not the inside. He took the scarf as evidence. It did not matter. Silas Becker had moved faster than David anticipated. By the following morning, a formal complaint had been filed with Judge Pruitt by Becker's lawyer, a man named Frank Hollies who wore too expensive boots and had come from somewhere east. The scarf. A statement from Roy Cates saying he had seen Caroline at the barn in the late hours with a lamp. The insurance policy. The missing deed, which the county clerk, a nervous man named Albert Grice who was in Becker's pocket, claimed had simply vanished from the records room. Pruitt issued an arrest warrant before David could file a counter-complaint. They came for Caroline at 2 in the morning. David was not there. Pruitt had deliberately sent Deputy Marsh, a man who was nominally David's deputy but who had been, David would later confirm, on Becker's informal payroll for months. By the time David found out and rode to the boarding house where Caroline and Thomas had been staying since the fire, she was already in the jailhouse. Thomas had seen them take her from the window. The child had not spoken since. Those 3 days were the most difficult of David Walker's life, and he had lived through things that would have broken other men. He worked without sleeping. He rode to every property within 5 miles of the Callahan claim, talking to every neighbor, every farm worker, every ranch hand who might have seen something. He found 2 men, Jim Reese, who ran sheep on the north pasture, and an elderly Mexican farmer named Ernesto Vasquez who had been in the country since before the territory was American, who had both seen Roy Cates near the Callahan barn in the days before the fire. He wrote everything down. He was meticulous about dates and signatures, and the chain of custody of every piece of evidence. He had been trained to do this by a marshal in Tucson who believed that good law was made of paper and patience, and David had never been more grateful for that training. He also, on the second day, rode the 60 miles to the territorial marshal's office in Santa Fe. Marshal Everett Haynes was a lean, gray-haired man who had been managing the legal complexities of New Mexico Territory for 12 years, and who had seen every variety of frontier injustice. He received David in his office, listened to the full account without interrupting, examined the evidence files, and said, with the quiet authority of a man who had no reason to perform power because he actually had it, "I've been watching the Becker situation for 8 months. I've been waiting for something solid enough to move on." "I have it," David said, "but I need a circuit judge who isn't owned by Becker." "Judge Callahan out of Albuquerque," Haynes said. "He's honest. I'll send him down." "And the clerk?" "Grice, leave Grice to me." David rode back to Redemption Creek in the dark, 60 miles at a pace that was hard on the horse and harder on him, and arrived at 4 in the morning to find Thomas asleep on a cot in the jailhouse office. Caroline had made an arrangement with Deputy Marsh, through sheer force of personality, to have Thomas brought to the jailhouse so she could see him each morning through the bars, and Caroline sitting in the cell, straight-backed, reading by lamplight a book that one of the women in town had left for her. She looked up when David came in. He told her about Haynes, about Judge Callahan. He told her everything. She listened, and when he finished she put the book down and said, "Albert Grice has the deed. He didn't destroy it. He's too frightened to destroy anything." "How do you know that?" "Because men like Grice always keep things. They think it protects them. He has it somewhere. Probably his office, probably in a locked drawer because he wouldn't risk taking it home in case his wife found it." David looked at her. "You have a remarkable mind," he said. "I have a clear head," she said. "Which is easier to maintain when you're not busy being afraid." She looked at him steadily through the bars. "David, Roy Cates, he's a hired man. He hired himself out to do this. That means he can be offered a better deal." "A deal?" "He's facing charges too if the real truth comes out. Arson, fraud, they might hang him if Prout runs the court. But if Haynes's man makes him an offer testimony in exchange for a reduced sentence, he might take it. He struck me as a man who didn't think through the consequences." "You met Roy Cates?" "Briefly. He was in town the morning after the fire watching. I saw him watching. I filed it away." David was silent for a moment. "Caroline," he said. "Yes." When this is over," she said, "come and say that to me without bars between us." He almost smiled. "Fair enough." He found the deed in Albert Grice's office at 5:30 that morning, using the authority of his badge and the knowledge that Grice, alone and trapped and terrified, would fold when confronted. Grice folded completely. He was weeping before David had finished his first question. He gave up the deed, gave up his signed statement confirming what Becker had instructed him to do, and gave up the name of the second county board member who had been on Becker's payroll. Roy Cates, approached by Marshal Haynes's deputy, who arrived in Redemption Creek on the afternoon of the 3rd day, was offered reduced charges in exchange for full testimony. He took the deal before the deputy finished explaining it. And so it was that on the morning of the 4th day, Judge Isaac Callahan of Albuquerque, a stocky, white-haired man with the no-nonsense bearing of a man who had heard every lie available in 3 territories, convened an emergency hearing in the Redemption Creek jailhouse, which doubled as the county's only proper meeting hall, with the full account of Silas Becker's conspiracy laid before him. David walked Thomas to the jailhouse. The boy had not spoken since his mother was taken. David crouched down to eye level outside the door, and he looked at the child steadily, and he told him the truth. "Your mama is the bravest person in this whole county, son." Thomas looked at him for a long moment. Then very quietly, "You really think so?" "I don't just think it, I know it." The boy's lower lip trembled. He nodded. He breathed. "Okay," Thomas said. "Okay." The hearing lasted 4 hours. Roy Cates testified first, his voice flat and careful, the voice of a man who had decided self-preservation was worth something. He described in specific detail the payments he had received from Becker's foreman, the instruction to start the fire, the placement of the scarf, the arrangement through Grice to remove the deed from the records. Albert Grice testified next. He could barely be heard at first, and had to be asked to speak up twice by Judge Callahan. But his statement was complete and signed, and corroborated by every document David had collected over 3 days without sleep. Then David himself testified methodically, without drama, presenting the water samples from February, the contamination report from Doc Greer, the eyewitness accounts of Reese and Vasquez placing Cates at the scene before the fire, the physical evidence of the fire being set from outside the barn, the timeline that made it impossible for Caroline to have set the fire herself given that she had been seen at the boarding house by the widow Miller at midnight, an hour before Cates set it, and had woken Thomas and gotten him out of the house within minutes of the smoke starting. Silas Becker, seated in the front row with his lawyer Frank Hollies, grew progressively more still as the morning went on, which was more frightening to those who knew him than agitation would have been. Judge Callahan dismissed all charges against Caroline Callahan in the early afternoon. He did so without equivocation. Then he issued arrest warrants for Silas Becker, Roy Cates, Albert Grice, and Frank Hollies on charges of conspiracy, fraud, arson, and subornation of perjury. He also sent a formal communication to the territorial governor, recommending that Judge Harlan Pruitt's appointment be reviewed, which was the judicial equivalent of a death sentence for Pruitt's career. Caroline was released from the cell by Deputy Marsh, who had the grace to look thoroughly ashamed of himself as he turned the key. She walked out into the main room of the jailhouse, and the first thing she saw was Thomas. He ran to her with the full, uninhibited force of an 8-year-old who has been holding himself together for 3 days past his capacity for holding, and she caught him and held him with her arms around him completely, his face pressed to her neck, her eyes closed. She held him for a long time. Nobody spoke. The crowd that had pressed into the room was quiet in the way crowds go quiet when they are witnessing something private that they cannot look away from. Then Thomas pulled back and looked at his mother's face and said, in a voice still rough from 3 days of silence, "The sheriff said you're the bravest person in the whole county." Caroline looked over his shoulder at David Walker, who was standing near the door with his hat in his hands. "Did he?" she said. "He really did," Thomas confirmed. She stood up, keeping one hand on Thomas's shoulder, and crossed the room to David. The crowd parted without anyone deciding to part. She stopped in front of him. She reached up and put her hand flat against his chest, over his badge, the way she had touched his jaw that April night in the kitchen doorway. A deliberate, chosen gesture. "You went to Santa Fe," she said quietly. "I did. You rode 60 miles in the dark." "The horse is fine," he said, mostly, her mouth curved. "David." "Yes, ma'am. I believe you said you had something to say to me without bars between us." The crowd, which had been pretending not to eavesdrop, stopped pretending entirely. "I did say that," he admitted. "Well," she said. He took her hand from his chest, turned it over, and held it in both of his. He looked at her with the same steady attention he had looked at her with since August of last year, the attention that was not demanding or consuming but simply, thoroughly present, as if she were the most important thing in his field of vision, and he saw no reason to pretend otherwise. "I love you, Caroline Callahan," he said. "I have for some time, and I would very much like to court you properly if you'll allow it, with Thomas's approval, which I intend to ask for separately." The crowd released a collective breath. Thomas, still standing beside his mother, said, "You don't have to ask separately. I already decided." Laughter rippled through the room, warm and releasing. Caroline looked at David, and her eyes were bright and her composure had been set aside for once, just for this moment, and she said, "You have my permission to court me, Sheriff. Lord knows you've already earned it." He raised her hand to his mouth and kissed it, which made the older women in the crowd sigh and the younger ones look immediately elsewhere and then immediately back. Silas Becker was arrested that afternoon by Marshal Haynes's deputy, along with Roy Cates and Albert Grice. Becker walked to the jail with the rigid bearing of a man who would not give the town the satisfaction of seeing him broken, and the town watched him go in silence, which was worse than anything they could have said. Frank Hollies, the lawyer, disappeared from Redemption Creek that evening and was caught 4 days later in Albuquerque trying to board a train to Denver. He was brought back in handcuffs. Judge Prout resigned before he could be formally reviewed and left the territory within the week. Nobody threw him a farewell. The trials were held in Albuquerque before Judge Callahan over the following 3 months. David testified at each of them. So did Caroline, whose testimony was precise, damning, and delivered without a single moment of uncertainty. Roy Cates received a reduced sentence of 5 years in the territorial prison. Albert Grice received 3 years and was barred from any public office. Frank Hollies received 7 years. Silas Becker, convicted of arson, fraud, conspiracy, and attempted theft of a legal land deed, received 15 years in the federal penitentiary in Denver, Colorado. His cattle operation was broken up, the land sold to settle his debts, and a portion of the proceeds, by a decision of Judge Callahan that David privately thought was the finest piece of jurisprudence he had ever witnessed, was awarded to Caroline Callahan as restitution for the losses she had sustained. The Henderson farm on the south side of the creek received similar restitution. The Henderson family and Caroline Callahan became close friends in the year that followed, a friendship built on shared hardship and the particular bond of people who have held ground together. Caroline rebuilt the eastern barn in November, with help from half the town of Redemption Creek, who showed up on a Saturday morning with lumber and tools, and an apology embedded in every nail they drove. She accepted their help graciously. She also accepted, privately, that the town's show of support was partly guilt-driven, since many of them had stood by and said nothing while she was dragged to jail in the early morning dark. She was not a woman who carried unnecessary bitterness, but she was a woman who remembered things accurately, and she filed this away in the practical part of her mind that kept track of who people really were under pressure. David courted her with the same careful, steady quality that characterized everything he did. He was not a man for grand gestures, and she did not want grand gestures. He was a man for showing up, and she had learned by that point that showing up consistently was worth more than any grand gesture ever conceived. He came on Sunday afternoons, when Thomas had finished his chores and could sit with them on the porch, and they would drink coffee and talk about everything. About the territory, about the law, about what Thomas wanted to be when he grew up, which changed weekly but had recently settled on either a horse doctor or a sheriff. He had not decided. He brought her books from the small lending library that Mrs. Patterson ran out of the back of her dry goods store. She read them and gave them back with her opinions, which were direct and frequently contrary to what he had expected, and which delighted him every time. Thomas gave his formal approval of the courtship in December, delivered over breakfast on a Sunday morning when Caroline was briefly outside, with the gravity of a 5-year-old who had given the matter serious consideration. "You can marry my mama," Thomas said, "if you are going to be around all the time and not go away." David looked at the boy. "I don't plan to go away," he said. "My papa went away," Thomas said. Not accusingly, just factually. "Your papa didn't choose to," David said carefully. "He was sick. That's different from choosing to leave." Thomas thought about this. "Do you get sick?" "Occasionally, nothing fatal so far." The boy nodded, weighing this. "Okay," he said, "you can marry her." "I appreciate it," David said seriously. "You should ask her soon," Thomas added. "She's been waiting." David raised an eyebrow. "Has she said that?" "No," Thomas said, "but I'm very observant." David proposed to Caroline in January, on a Sunday afternoon when the light came in low and gold through the kitchen window, and Thomas was at the Miller house, visiting with the Miller boys. He did not make a speech. He had bought a ring in Albuquerque, a simple silver band with a small turquoise stone, the kind of thing that was made in the territory and was honest and beautiful in the way that simple-made things are honest and beautiful, and he set it on the table between them and said, "Caroline, marry me." She looked at the ring. Then she looked at him. The warmth in her face was complete and unguarded, the full version of the expression she usually kept carefully moderated. "You're not even going to ask a proper question," she said. "I've been asking you a question for the better part of a year," he said. You know what it is." She picked up the ring and turned it in the light. The turquoise caught the winter sun. "Yes," she said. "David, yes." He took the ring from her and put it on her finger, and then she put both hands on either side of his face, the careful, deliberate tenderness that was her particular way, and kissed him with the warmth of a woman who had decided fully and without reservation. They were married in March of 1886, at the small white church on the north end of Redemption Creek's Main Street. On a Saturday morning, when the early spring had brought the first green to the hills, and the air smelled of creek water and sage. The whole town came, including several people who had the grace to be openly glad, and a few who simply could not resist a wedding. Thomas stood beside David as the ceremony's self-appointed second witness, wearing a new suit that Caroline had sewn for him, and a solemnity that broke into a grin the moment David kissed the bride. The minister, a young man named Reverend Cole, who had been in Redemption Creek for only a year, and who was therefore not implicated in any of the preceding year's politics, said the words over them with a genuine smile. David kissed Caroline in front of the full congregation and Thomas in half of New Mexico territory, and the congregation cheered in the direct, unself-conscious way of frontier people who needed reasons to celebrate and took them seriously when they came. The reception was held at the feed store, which was the only building in town large enough, and Bill Hannigan provided the space and considerable quantities of his wife's apple cake, which was legendary in the county. The Henderson family brought fiddles. There was dancing. Thomas danced with every woman who asked him, with the earnest formality of a boy who was going to be remarkable when he grew up, which most people in the room had already decided. David and Caroline danced once, in the center of the room, and the crowd arranged itself around them with the instinctive courtesy of people who understood they were watching something particular. She danced with her head slightly tilted up toward him, and he kept one hand at the small of her back with the steady, proprietary warmth of a man who had been given something precious and knew it. "Happy?" he asked her. "Yes," she said, without hesitation or qualification. "Completely." They settled into married life with the practical ease of two people who had been moving toward each other for so long that the arrival felt natural rather than dramatic. Caroline kept the Callahan claim, which she had legally retained under her own name for the purposes of the water rights, a practical decision David supported entirely because he understood water rights, and also because he understood that her independence was not a problem to be solved, but a quality to be honored. He moved into the farmhouse, which was large enough for a family and more comfortable than the single room above the jailhouse where he had been living, and commuted the 2 miles to town each morning on the same fast horse. They spent the evenings at the kitchen table, David with his case files, Caroline with her accounts and her books, Thomas with his schoolwork spread between them, the lamp making a warm circle of light that held all three of them. It was the domestic peace that neither of them had been certain they would ever have, and they did not take it lightly. They had both learned in different ways what it cost. In the summer of 1886, Caroline told David she was expecting their first child. She told him on a Tuesday evening, matter-of-factly, the way she did most things, setting a cup of coffee in front of him at the table and saying, "I spoke with Doc Greer today." He looked up from his files. "The baby will come in February," she said. "According to Doc Greer, he says I'm healthy and there's no reason to expect difficulty." David was very still for a moment. Then he stood up from the table, took the coffee cup out of her hands, set it carefully to the side, and pulled her against him with both arms, his face pressed to the top of her head. She could feel him breathing the slight acceleration that was as close as David Walker got to losing composure. "February," he said. "February. Thomas is going to have opinions." "Thomas has already been informed," she said. "He requested a brother. He said he has enough female influence in his life." David pulled back to look at her face. His expression was something she would remember for the rest of her life, not just happiness, but a deep, full gratitude that went beyond the moment. the look of a man who had spent years being careful about hope and was now carefully allowing himself to have it. "I love you," he said. "I know," she said. She touched the crooked line of his jaw. "I love you too." Thomas, as it turned out, got his wish. The baby born in February of 1887 was a boy, 7 pounds and healthy, with David's dark hair and Caroline's watchful, steady eyes. They named him James Martin Walker James for David's father, Martin for Caroline's first husband, because Caroline felt that the past should be honored rather than erased, and David agreed. Thomas took his role as elder brother with complete seriousness. He was 6 years old and decided, within the first 24 hours of James's existence, that he personally was responsible for the baby's education, safety, and general character development. David observed this with a quiet pride that he expressed mainly by telling Caroline, late at night when the boys were asleep, that Thomas was going to be extraordinary. "I know," Caroline said. "He always was." The years that followed were the years both of them had been working toward without knowing it, not perfect years, because no years are perfect but full ones. The farm expanded. Caroline added a second field and negotiated a wheat contract with the mill in Las Cruces. David, whose reputation as a methodical and incorruptible lawman had been considerably enhanced by the Becker case, was offered the position of district marshal covering 3 counties in 1888, which he accepted after talking it over with Caroline for 2 evenings at the kitchen table. The promotion meant more travel, which was the part he liked least. But it also meant a genuine opportunity to build the kind of systemic legal infrastructure that the territory needed, to do at a larger level what he had done in Redemption Creek. To make the law something real, something that held, something that could not be bought by the next Silas Becker who came along. Caroline supported him in this with the wholehearted, unambiguous quality that was her way. She did not minimize the difficulty of the work or pretend the absences were easy. She was honest about both, honest that she missed him when he was gone, honest that the work mattered, honest that she could manage the farm and the boys, and honest that she expected him to come home. He always came home. By 1889, Thomas was 10 years old and James was 2, and had developed an extremely determined personality that manifested mostly in strong opinions about which direction things should go, which David said was entirely his mother's influence and Caroline said was entirely his father's. The argument about this was one of their happiest recurring disagreements, the kind that exist in marriages where the people involved actually like each other. Thomas had settled on wanting to be a lawyer. He had made this decision after sitting in on a territorial circuit court proceeding in Las Cruces, where David had been testifying, and watching the judge manage the room with the authority of a man whose weapon was language and logic. Thomas had been transfixed. On the ride home, he had asked David 17 questions about the law, each one more specific than the last, and David had answered all of them. "You'd be a good one," David told him. "I know," Thomas said, without arrogance but with the same honest self-assessment that he had inherited from Caroline. In the spring of 1890, Caroline and David found out they were expecting again. Doc Greer, who had been their family physician since the beginning and who had watched the whole arc of their story with the warm satisfaction of a man who had seen enough of the other kind, delivered the news with a smile. "The baby will come in November," he said. "You're both getting practiced at this." James was 3 and fascinated by the concept of a new baby in a way that mostly expressed itself as repeatedly pressing his ear to his mother's stomach and reporting what he heard, which was usually nothing, but which he described in vivid detail anyway. Thomas, for his part, began making a formal study of whether the second child would be a boy or a girl by interviewing every older woman in Redemption Creek about their theories on the subject. He compiled their responses in a small notebook with the methodical seriousness of a person who intends to be a lawyer and therefore wants evidence. The baby born in November 1890 was a girl, which Thomas received with the good grace of a scientist whose hypothesis has been disproven by reliable data. He revised his position immediately and announced that he was very pleased with a sister and that James would benefit from not being the youngest, since being the youngest was not good for character development. They named her Clara for David's mother, who had died when he was young, and whom he had described to Caroline one winter evening in the kind of detail that meant someone was still missed. Clara had dark hair and a smile that appeared within the first week and did not go away. Life in Redemption Creek had changed in the years since the Becker case, not just for the Walkers but for the community at large. The town had grown, a new school building, a proper post office, a second doctor, a women's literary society that Caroline had helped establish and which met on the first Tuesday of each month. The incoming wave of settlers that characterized the late territorial period had brought people of many backgrounds and the attendant complications. And David, in his capacity as district marshal, worked carefully and consistently to ensure that the law he administered was applied with the same standard across all of them: Anglo settlers, Mexican families who had been in the territory since before it was a territory, and the smaller communities of people from every other direction that the frontier had gathered. It was not always simple. The territory was still raw in places, still subject to the pressures and prejudices that David had no illusions about erasing single-handed. But he was a methodical man who believed in persistent effort over dramatic intervention, and he worked at it the way he worked at everything, steadily, without stopping, without pretending the difficult parts were not difficult. Caroline was involved in this too, in ways that were less official but not less significant. She had a reputation in the county by now that was partly built on the Becker case and partly built on the 12 years of consistent, quiet presence she had maintained since she arrived on that August stage. People came to her with problems. She was direct and clear and did not tell anyone what they wanted to hear, and somehow this made her the person people most wanted to ask. She sat on the school board. She helped negotiate a water rights dispute between two ranch families on the south side of the county that had been festering for years, using the same careful documentation David had once used on her behalf. David watched her do all of this and had the same feeling about it that he had about most things Caroline did: quiet, profound pride that did not need to announce itself. Thomas went east for law school in 1897, when he was 16 years old. Caroline had spent 3 years preparing him academically, and David had spent the same 3 years calling in every contact he had made across his career to find the right scholarship. The day Thomas left, standing at the stage depot with his bag and his serious face, he shook David's hand first, and then, after a moment's consideration, abandoned the formal handshake and hugged him instead, with the force of a boy who had decided that a man who had been his father in every way that mattered deserved to be embraced. David held on for a moment. "Take care of yourself," he said when they stepped apart. "Write to your mother every week," Thomas promised. He looked at Caroline, who was standing with James and Clara behind David. Her eyes were bright. "Mama." She hugged him and said nothing for a moment, and then she said into the side of his head, "You are going to be extraordinary. I have always known it." Thomas stepped back and his throat worked and he nodded. "I learned it from you," he said. The stage took him east, and the Walker family watched it go until it rounded the curve in the road and disappeared. And then Clara, who was 6 years old and had been following her brother's moods with the attentive empathy of a perceptive youngest child, took her mother's hand on one side and her father's on the other and said, practically, "He'll come back." "Yes," Caroline said. "He will." "He promised," Clara confirmed. James, who was 10 and had his own views on everything, said, "He'd better, because I'm not doing all his chores." The years that Thomas was away were busy years for the Walker family. James grew into a compact, energetic 12-year-old who had his father's methodical nature and his mother's directness, and no particular talent for being still, which expressed itself in a constant series of projects. A henhouse he had redesigned for greater efficiency. A small irrigation system he had dug himself along the lower field. A shed for the new horse he had negotiated Caroline into buying by preparing a written argument that David had privately reviewed and found very sound. Clara, growing up the youngest in a household of strong personalities, developed her own quieter in style than either of her brothers, but with an interior precision that showed up in everything she did. She was the one who noticed when things were off. She was the one who remembered what people said. She was going to be remarkable in ways that had not yet fully revealed themselves, and both David and Caroline could see it. David was 50 years old in 1903 and had been district marshal for 15 years. He began thinking, privately, about what came next, not with any particular urgency, but with the honest acknowledgement that he had been wearing a badge for 22 years, and that the territory was about to become a state, and the landscape of law enforcement was going to change accordingly. He talked to Caroline about it over several evenings, the way they talked about everything important at the kitchen table directly without preamble. "What would you do," she asked him, "if not this?" He was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about the land," he said, "about actually working it, being here." She looked at him steadily. He had spent 22 years in one form or another being responsible for an entire county's and then 3 counties' worth of safety. He had done it well. He had done it with more integrity than most men in his position managed. He had earned this. "Then let's do that," she said. He retired in 1904, at 51, after the creation of New Mexico State required a reorganization of the territorial law enforcement structure that provided a natural transition point. He handed his marshal's badge to his successor, a young man he had trained and trusted, and came home to the farm. The first morning he woke up without having to ride anywhere official. He lay in bed beside Caroline in the early light and felt the particular quality of a silence that contained nothing urgent. It was remarkable. "How does it feel?" Caroline asked. She was already partly awake, as she usually was, with the farmer's ingrained habit of early rising. "Strange," he said. "Good." She turned toward him in the morning light, and he looked at her 45 years old now, her dark hair carrying threads of silver, the lines at the corners of her eyes from 20 years of New Mexico sun and laughter, the steadiness still there behind her eyes exactly as it had been the day she stepped off the stage from Albuquerque, and he felt the same shift in the landscape he had felt then. 20 years on, it still happened. He thought it probably always would. "I love you," he said. She reached up and touched his jaw, the old gesture, the deliberate and chosen one. "I know," she said. "I love you too." Thomas came home from the East in 1905, now 24 years old, carrying a law degree and a set of ideas about territorial rights and corporate land law that were going to be useful in a state that was still sorting out its own legal identity. He arrived on the southbound stage from Albuquerque, which felt like a return to something. The same stage, the same depot, the same long road from the mountains to the valley. He was taller than David now, lean like Caroline, with the same steady eyes. He stood at the depot and looked around at the town that had grown and changed and said, "It's bigger." "It is," David said. "Is the jailhouse still there?" "It is," Thomas nodded. "Good." "I have plans for the legal character of this county," David laughed. It was a full, warm laugh, the kind that came from genuine delight. "Of course you do." Caroline held Thomas for a long moment at the depot, and he held her back with the arms of a grown man, and she said quietly, "You did it." "We did it," he said. "You started it." Thomas established a law practice in Redemption Creek the following year. He was, as everyone had predicted, very good. He was also, nobody was surprised to learn, extremely stubborn in court, which made him difficult to argue against and therefore unusually effective. He met a young woman named Alice Rays, the daughter of the sheep-ranching Rays family whose land adjoined the Callahan claim on the north side, in the spring of 1906. Alice was 22 years old, a schoolteacher who read more books per month than most people read per year, and she and Thomas recognized each other in the particular way of people who have spent most of their lives slightly ahead of their surroundings and are relieved to find someone keeping pace. Caroline and David observed this with the warm satisfaction of people who had done enough of their own falling in love to recognize the signs, and said nothing that was not requested, which was the right thing to do. By Christmas of 1906, Thomas and Alice were engaged. The announcement was made at the Walker family Sunday dinner, with James and Clara at the table, and the response was immediate and noisy and completely sincere. James, who was now 19 and had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes and opinions about everything, said, "Finally, I've been watching this for 6 months and it was taking forever." Clara, 16 and sharp as a pin, said, "It was 6.5 months, actually." "And it was romantic," James said. "It was slow." "It was deliberate," Thomas said with dignity. David caught Caroline's eye across the table. She was smiling in the complete, unguarded way that she reserved for moments that were genuinely good. He reached across the corner of the table and took her hand and squeezed it once. She squeezed back. The farm in the summer of 1907 was the most abundant it had been in 20 years of working. David had spent the year since his retirement relearning the land with the same methodical attention he had given everything else, and it showed. The lower field was yielding well. The cattle herd was healthy. The new section they had planted with a variety of wheat that James had researched was thriving. James, now 20, had decided he wanted to be a farmer and a horse breeder, which surprised nobody who had been paying attention. He had been managing the stock since he was 15 with a competence that went beyond his years, and he had an instinct for animals that both David and Caroline recognized as a genuine gift. He bought his first breeding pair in the spring with money he had saved since he was 12, and the pride he took in this transaction was one of the most David-like things about him. Clara finished school with the highest marks the Redemption Creek School had recorded and went to the Women's College in Albuquerque at 17, which was earlier than typical but which was simply what was called for, as the principal put it, somewhat helplessly. She came home for summers and filled the house with opinions and books and a fierce engagement with the world that made every dinner conversation better. Thomas and Alice married in April of 1907 in the same white church where David and Caroline had married 21 years before. The Ray's family and the Walker family took up most of the pews. The town came, as it had come for the first wedding, and there was fiddle music again in the feed store afterward, and apple cake, because Mrs. Hannigan had retired but her daughter had the recipe and the same competence with it. Caroline danced with David again, 21 years after the first time, and the crowd gave them the same space the crowd had given them then, with the warm recognition of people who knew they were watching something that had held. She looked up at him in the same way, her head tilted slightly. 21 years, she said. Not nearly enough, he said. She laughed, full and warm and unguarded. No, she agreed. Not nearly. The autumn of 1907 brought the first frost early, which was not unusual for the mountains but caught the lower valley off guard. David and James worked 3 days bringing in the last of the harvest before the cold hit, working side by side in the easy, competent partnership of a father and son who had been working together since James was old enough to carry anything useful. Caroline brought lunch to the field every noon, bread and cold meat and coffee, and sat with them while they ate, and looked at her husband and her son together in the gold afternoon light, and felt the particular fullness that only belongs to people who have built something real. In December of 1907, Thomas and Alice announced they were expecting a child. The news arrived at Sunday dinner with the same family gathering at the same table, and the response was loud and warm. James said he would teach the baby to ride as soon as was physically feasible. Clara, home for Christmas, immediately began making plans for its education. Caroline held Alice's hands and looked at her with the steady warmth that was her particular way of expressing care. David said to Thomas, Later in the evening, when the women were in the kitchen and James had gone to check the horses, "You're going to be a good father." Thomas looked at him. The firelight made the room warm and the evening was settled around them with the particular quiet of December in New Mexico. "I had a good example," Thomas said. It was the simplest thing he could have said, and it was the most complete. David was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your papa, your first father, Martin, he loved you. Your mother has told you that. It's true." "I know," Thomas said. "She told me all of it, all my life." He paused. "And I know what you did for us, for her. And for me." He looked at his hands for a moment. "I have two fathers and I am lucky for both of them." David nodded once. His throat was working. "You are," he said finally and meant it, "going to be extraordinary." Thomas smiled, Caroline's smile, the full and unguarded version. "I know," he said. "I learned it from my mother, and from you." The child born to Thomas and Alice Walker in July of 1908 was a boy. They named him David Martin Walker. The David for his grandfather, and the Martin for the great man his grandmother had loved, and who had started this whole chain of events by leaving a deed to land in New Mexico territory to his wife. Baby David had the Ray's family's coloring and Thomas's watchful eyes, and from the very first week was clearly going to have opinions about everything. James, who had been appointed unofficial horse consultant to the family and took all appointments seriously, held the baby for the first time with the concentrated carefulness of a 21-year-old who had more experience with young animals than young humans, and said with genuine wonder, "He's very small." "He'll grow," Caroline said dryly. "Obviously," James said. "I'm not worried about that." Clara, home for the summer, held the baby and talked to him in a quiet, earnest voice about the importance of education, which baby David appeared to accept with great equanimity, possibly because he was 3 weeks old. David Walker held his grandson and was quiet for a long time. Caroline watched him from across the room with the full steadiness of a woman who had been watching this man for 22 years and knew every register of his silence. He looked up and found her watching, and his expression was the one she knew best of all, the deep, unguarded gratitude. The look of a man who had spent years being careful about hope and had been given, abundantly, more than he had hoped for. He crossed the room to her, still holding the baby, and she reached up and put her hand against his face, the old gesture, the deliberate one. "Caroline," he said. "Yes," she said, knowing it was not a question. "Thank you," he said. She raised her eyebrows slightly. "For what specifically?" "For getting off that stage," he said. "For not leaving when Becker came. For staying. For building this." He looked around the room at Thomas and Alice closed together on the settee, at James still watching the baby with wonder, at Clara already writing something in a small notebook, at the warm and particular life that was gathered here in this room. For all of it. She took the baby gently from him and handed little David to Thomas, and then turned back to her husband and took both his hands. "I didn't build it alone," she said. "No," he agreed. "We didn't." She looked at him for a moment in the warm, specific way that still had the power, 22 years in, to make him feel like the world had shifted slightly to accommodate something important. "David Walker," she said. "Caroline Walker," he said. "You are," she said, "the best thing that ever happened to this farm." He laughed. The real, full laugh that she had given him back years ago by simply being herself. "Just the farm," he said. She smiled, completely unguarded, the whole of it. "And this county," she said, "and these children and me." He kissed her in the middle of the room with all their family around them. And James made a theatrical noise of protest, and Clara applauded, and Thomas and Alice laughed, and little David Martin Walker, oblivious and serene, slept through the whole thing. The night wind came in over the New Mexico hills and moved through the long grass and the wheat fields and the cattle pasture, and the farmhouse held its warm light against the dark the way it always had, the way it had through drought and fire and injustice and 3 days in a jailhouse and every ordinary hard and beautiful day in between. The Callahan claim had a new name on the deed now, Walker Farm. But Caroline had kept the original deed in the locked box under the floorboard, and Thomas knew it was there. And someday he would tell his son the story of how his grandmother had stepped off a stage from Albuquerque with a carpet bag and a boy on her hip, and a piece of paper that said this ground was hers, and had made it true by the force of her particular, iron-centered, wholly undefeatable self. And the boy who would hear that story would look up with Walker eyes in a Ray's face, and he would say, as his grandfather had once said, crouching to eye level in a jailhouse doorway, "I know." Because knowing it, the truth of what his grandmother was and what his family had made together in this red soil New Mexico valley was simply part of what it meant to be a walker, to carry the steadiness, to show up, to hold the ground that mattered, to love without apology and without ceasing in a land that had tried its best to make such things impossible and had failed.